what is interesting to me about presidents is that I think there's a belief that somehow the institution of the presidency will change them, that they may be someone before, but then they take the oath of office and they will be someone different. And I would argue that who you are will only manifest more evidently inside the institution of the presidency than not.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we're honored to have scholar Lara Brown, who is going to discuss her new book, Amateur Hour, Presidential Character and the Question of Leadership, as part of a new series on the American presidency. And the guiding question for this series is, what are the constitutional powers and limits of the American presidency? And Dr. Lara Brown is a professor and director of the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. She's an expert on national elections, candidate strategies, political scandals, and presidential leadership. She has written and edited 4 books, including Amateur Hour, has written for dozens of publications, and is a frequent guest and makes many media appearances, sharing her expertise. And we're lucky to have her doing so today. So Lara, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's wonderful to have a chance to speak with you.
Great. You know, one of the reasons I love Amateur Hour is that it's not only just a very readable book, a nice brief book on presidential leadership kind of throughout history, especially our most recent history, with some really interesting biographical details and, of course, an examination of their presidencies, which is always fascinating. But you just write in such a remarkably even-handed way. I mean, you're so fair. You're describing some pretty controversial presidencies. You're looking at Republicans and Democrats. And, frankly, I don't think a reader would come away knowing where you stand personally on your politics. So take that as a real compliment that it is a very, very even-handed book, but also some great analysis of all these different presidencies. So why don't we jump into the conversation then? And my first question is examining what you think are the most important traits of presidential character, and what impact does character play both in fulfilling the various roles of the office, but also in exercising both the constitutional powers, but also seeing restraints in the office of the presidency?
Well, so first, let me just say thanks for the kind words about my writing. I do believe that when we're trying to understand presidents, partisanship really shouldn't play a role in the sense of my own viewpoint. At the end of the day, as a scholar, I often say what I want personally is really pretty irrelevant. What I am interested in is kind of how we can get to really great leadership from individual politicians. And this is where I sort of look at this in a couple different ways. I mean, it's important to understand that my background is really studying kind of very traditional philosophy, right? I mean, in college and graduate school, I did read a lot of Aristotle and Machiavelli, and I've thought a lot about leadership broadly. It is also true that I wrote my dissertation on kind of the impacts of scandals on incumbent members of Congress. And what really drove that was an interest in character. Does character matter to the electorate? Do they really think about or value and weigh judgments about politicians on their character? So this is a book, I would say, that came out of a lot, but it's really something of a distillation to what I believe, which is what Heraclitus said hundreds, now thousands of years ago, that man's character is his fate. And that at the end of the day, kind of who you are is what becomes in your life. And so what is interesting to me about presidents is that I think there's a belief that somehow the institution of the presidency will change them, that they may be someone before, but then they take the oath of office and they will be someone different. And I would argue that who you are will only manifest more evidently inside the institution of the presidency than not. So I'll just pause there and we can pick up on any of those threads.
Right. So how does it, let's follow up with that. How does it magnify these character traits? Is it because of the stresses of the office, or it's just characters revealed in these crises or in the everyday stresses of the office, domestic, international affairs? What makes you say that?
Well, so the office itself, I think, is interesting. And this is the other reason why I tend to study presidential leadership. It's interesting because Article 2 is very short and it is very vague. And what that means when we think about those constitutional powers is that I believe there is a tremendous amount of latitude for the individual to kind of impact the system. So while it is true that your agency may not result in grand policies or huge governmental shifts, because our government itself kind of rests on a system of separation of powers and checks and balances, I still believe that the president can change the executive branch quite profoundly, and that their personal imprint really does make a difference over time. And so what I was kind of interested in is, right, how do we get to the essence of a person? What does a person really sort of do when they are trying to demonstrate leadership? And this is where the book kind of digs into this idea that character is an internal sense of oneself. Reputation is an externally derived kind of judgment. And there is, I think, an imperative on most politicians to try to create the most sort of approval from an external standpoint as possible. And what that means is that they are often engaged in kind of acting in specific ways that they hope will generate the reputation they want, and that from that reputation, the public will then infer a specific kind of character. And this is where I think our public pronouncements or judgments or our opinion about what kinds of presidents we should have matter tremendously in terms of the kinds of people we get. Because I think politicians are aiming and aspiring to meet those sorts of judgments as often as possible.
And you offered two examples of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as two exemplars of presidential character, of mastery of the office, and ability to meet those crises or lay down precedents. Why Washington and Lincoln?
Because both of them were internally reflective and externally striving and ambitious for a great amount of approbation from the public. I think when you look at both of those men and you look at their lives, you can't help but see that these were individuals who their kind of original temperaments were not necessarily what they knew would be well suited for high office. And so they worked on themselves, they refined themselves, they studied and learned how to engage in different kinds of leadership behaviors. I basically, in my book, distill leadership into kind of three big categories. One is what I call kind of the courage category. And this is where you're demonstrating some level of strength or force or risk taking. And then, those behaviors kind of begin to be that attribute. Boy, that person has a lot of courage. Then there's also another leadership behavior that I call curiosity. And it is actually about trying to appear discerning or reflective or thoughtful, not too hasty. And usually when presidents are engaged in kind of curiosity-driven leadership behaviors, they'll say things like, I think we need to have a commission to study this problem. I think, it's important to ask some experts. They tend to pause and take a step back and try not to do what you might do if you were in the courage leadership, which is rush in. And then I think there's a third kind of leadership behavior that is, I call compassion. And it is really about witnessing the emotional content in the moment, right? So your job in that kind of leadership role is to reflect the emotions of the public. If there is a tremendous amount of anger, then it's important to demonstrate that you too have a sense of anger at whatever injustice it is you are witnessing. You state your feelings, right? And this is where you are trying to help basically the public and those that you are leading kind of digest what is happening and hold the moment, hold the symbolism and the content.
Well, let's look at some of the more recent examples of presidential character that maybe served the nation well and the office well over the past few decades. Who demonstrated those characteristics of courage and curiosity and so forth?
Well, so I will say that I sort of jokingly refer to these trio of traits as the Wizard of Oz, right? In order for Dorothy to get down the road, the yellow brick road, and get home, she has to have the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow, right? This is courage, curiosity, and compassion, and you need all of them. And I think when you look at our contemporary presidents, which is really what this book focuses on, those presidents from Jimmy Carter through President Trump, that what you see is that both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton are probably the most successful at, I think, doing these kinds of behaviors, right? They knew when to take kind of a courageous stand. They knew when to show a sense of compassion. They knew when to kind of pause or engage in some levels of curiosity. And I don't think it should surprise us much. Ronald Reagan, not only was he a legitimate actor, but he was also the president of a labor union for 3 different terms. And then he was governor of California. And then he stepped into the presidency. So he was serving in a lot of executive kind of roles where he needed to display these kind of different leadership traits at different times. Similarly, Bill Clinton, while he lost a run for the House of Representatives early in his political career, but then he served as 12 years in the role of governor in Arkansas. And again, after 12 years of kind of running and engaging and leading, he certainly knew at the national level what it meant to respond to certain crises in different ways. And I will say, both their presidents had difficult times. They were not perfect in their terms. Certainly, President Reagan had difficulty when you look at the Iran-Contra scandal. President Clinton obviously had the Lewinsky scandal, but prior to that, he had a first couple years that were incredibly rocky. So even they weren't, I would say, exemplars, but they were certainly much further ahead than I think any of our other contemporary presidents were in terms of having the public appreciate the work that they did and look back on their presidencies with some level of kind of reflective nostalgia. And I think that that's important because what they really did try to do was lead the entire nation as opposed to only be the partisan warrior or essentially the very narrow technocrat that we saw some of our other presidents engage with.
And indeed, let's talk about those other presidents then. We've looked at a few examples who did well. Now maybe provide a few examples where presidential character has fallen short, and what are the consequences for the office itself, but also for the country and maybe even, the Constitution.
Well, so let me just say something about Jimmy Carter, because I think he's so interesting, right? I mean, Jimmy Carter is somebody who really does, and most people believe that he has a genuinely sincere, warm, good character. I mean, I don't think there are many people who would malign him. But I think what my book tries to show is that he comes at almost everything from a place of curiosity. And the problem with sort of curiosity being your strongest leadership skill is that you often tend to alienate people. And there were ways in which I think, President Carter just was not adept at the kind of compassion side of the equation, which then left him so vulnerable when the economy was faltering or when people kept asking, why isn't there more going on with the Iranian hostage situation? Because he kept sort of relying on the experts, and he was in some ways neither willing to take the risk that would put him in the courage place. And then when it came to gas prices, he couldn't really understand the compassionate side of the equation. So this is where I do think it's a fascinating thing, because the bigger question is, does the man meet the moment? Or is that moment sort of needing a different man, right? And obviously I say that with the idea that at some point, I hope there will be women in this office. But for now, it has been men. And what we have seen is that some have really, faltered. I mean, I do think that I'm kind of equally harsh to both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And it is not to say that I think either individual is sort of a bad person. I just don't think that their prior experience really suited them for office. And I think their prior experience kind of set them each up to be real, true partisan base warriors. And that ended up creating, I think, some of the polarization that we are living with now, and that sort of President Trump only amplified.
And he certainly did that, as you describe in the book with numerous examples. So my last question is how can we reverse this trend towards amateur hour then, and maybe get an office occupied by more experienced, sort of less celebrity presidents and presidents who really have those three C's to provide, and restore presidential character so that it might support, constitutionalism, greater restraint, but also greater prestige for the office?
Yeah, so this is where it's interesting. And I'll sort of just hearken back to both George H.W. Bush as well as current President Joe Biden. Both of them had a tremendous amount of experience. And so a lot of people say to me, but Lara, a lot of people with a great amount of experience haven't necessarily succeeded in the presidential office. And I would say that is true. But again, I think what you have to understand is what is the nature of their experience. I do think that the Senate generally is a poor training ground for the presidency. It is partly a poor training ground because you are one of 100 who are in a very elite position, and you are very secure politically in the sense that your seat only comes up once every 6 years. And it's also true that when you're one of 100, you can kind of hide. So this is where I would say that I think probably governorships are a better training ground. That being said, governors are never going to know how Washington works. And so this is also where it's going to be rocky if you come from that sort of a background. But I do believe, and I do make the argument in the book, that the most dangerous background is not necessarily senator or somebody like George H.W. Bush, where he was a little bit more like Herbert Hoover, where he had a lot of positions, but not necessarily always elected positions. And this is where I say the worst thing and the most dangerous thing is somebody who has no attachment to our political system whatsoever. And what I mean by that is they have no prior elective office experience. They might not even have political science or law as a background in their education. I think what we know about former President Trump is what we would know about, Ben Affleck or, any of the other sort of, Matthew McConaughey, Democrats who have said that they have kind of larger ambitions. And that is that they don't fundamentally understand the nature of our democratic system. They don't respect or appreciate checks and balances, institutional prerogatives and constraints. And I don't think they perceive the role of the president as anything other than a CEO. And that is a really bad model for what a president in a democratic system that does have separation of powers, that does appreciate and have to deal with a tremendous amount of federalism and kind of local politics as well. It's a completely different world. And I think it is very dangerous when you select people who are being selected because they are a celebrity and because you think you know them, you think you like their kind of known public behavior, which might be, quite frankly, pretty awful. And what you find out is really all they are is their celebrity and not much else.
Well, we'll have to be a little wary of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Jay-Z and Oprah Winfrey and all the rest.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to Ross Perot. I do think that this idea that you can know nothing about our system and that will help you manage and succeed in our system is probably one of the most naive and ridiculous kind of logics that Americans have said to themselves. Because quite frankly, it is true that people say, oh, well, politics is the only profession where you don't need any experience. there is no way in the world that our framers would have ever believed that. And they were certainly not the gentlemen farmers of myth. They were men who were deeply engaged in political and civic conversation for decades before they stepped in to any official offices in our country.
An excellent point to end on. Laura, I want to thank you very much for joining us. The book is Amateur Hour, Presidential Character and the Question of Leadership. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tony.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other interviews in the series on the American presidency and from our extensive library of interviews on the topic, including the Cold War and the Presidency series, Steve Knott on the Constitutional and Populist Presidency, and Sarah Burns on the Presidency and War Powers. Also, please check out our highly popular BRI curriculum, Presidents and the Constitution. Thank you for joining us.